Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I want to share with you the books and the resources we use to put together our botany main lesson block. Now we've only done half of this unit so far, so these are the resources that we have used for about 7 to 8 lessons, and this unit will probably run about 7 weeks, and we've done about 3 weeks of it so far. So the first thing I want to share with you are the curriculum resources that we're using for this unit. We're doing a Waldorf inspired main lesson block on botany. We have the Charles Kovacs book on botany. These are short chapters that go through the different lessons that you would do for a botany unit. We haven't used this book before. This is our first time using this book. We've used, in the past, we've used the Live Education Waldorf curriculum. And so I'm finding that this one has more chapters on varying plants that are of the higher plant order versus the plants that are, they're not the higher plants. They don't represent, like, say, a plant that has flowers and blossoms and fruits and true leaves and stems, etc. And so far for our lessons, we've only gotten up to just before conifers, so we haven't actually been able to use the majority of this book, but I do like having it as an additional resource. And if you wanted to explore the Waldorf approach, this might be a nice small investment in figuring out whether the way that these lessons are oriented is something that you might enjoy. In the past and currently, again, we're using our Live Education Waldorf curriculum, and I really like the approach that the Live Education takes for the main lesson blocks and for botany as well. It's really a beautiful representation of the lessons. I like all the artistry, and I also like the progression of the lessons. So before we go into the resources for each lesson, I do want to share with you some of the resources that we use just to kind of embellish our unit a little bit. So new for this unit, or for the school year really, are a few resources for this botany main lesson block. Now traditionally I'll do the main lesson blocks in science in the spring, and currently it's the fall and we have started our botany unit in the fall, which is very unusual for us. However, we're only doing half. The other half will complete at the end of the school year in the spring. And actually, we started this unit last school year in the spring. We only did one lesson, barely one lesson, and then we didn't do the unit at all. And so it's a bit of I guess, continuing a main lesson block that we started. So we decided to approach it a little bit differently this time around, just a little bit. For the most part, it'll be pretty similar. However, I did buy a couple of new resources for this. So I'm going to show you a ton of resources. I'm going to tell you the ones that we really use and I would recommend versus the ones that we might have only used a few pages out of it. And if it wasn't already in our home library, I wouldn't have made it a special purchase for this unit. So new for this unit is Watercolor in Nature. And I was kind of excited about this book so that we could do a little more watercoloring with our units. And we do watercoloring quite a bit, but as artistry is not my natural talent. I've had to learn over the years, and I do a lot of copying, and I think that's probably how I'm able to do a lot of the artwork, is just by copying other illustrations. And so I thought this book might help us with that, as for drawing and for watercolor in particular. I have to say that I wasn't super crazy about it once I got the book and was able to kind of thumb through it. I wasn't as excited about the book as I thought I would be. So we haven't actually used it yet. And also I end up doing this whole unit with color pencils. So I want to share with you that we're using our main lesson books from A Child's Dream. And these books are about 9 by 12 inches. They're a little bit larger than 9 by 12 inches. They only come with white pages, like there are no lines on the pages, and they also have a bit of tissue paper between the two papers. Usually by about this age, when you're doing a main lesson block in the, say, upper elementary and junior high level, you're probably sizing down to smaller main lesson books that maybe are more about 8.5 by 11. and they traditionally have lines as well. However, we wanted to do these ones. I like the look of them. They have more pages. They are a little bit larger, easier to get our artwork and our writing in. And also, we are towards the end of our whole homeschooling journey, and we still have a few of these. So I wanted to use them versus buying new ones that are smaller, because I don't have many of the ones that are smaller. So I'll show you, instead of, so I have actually a main lesson book as well as my daughter. Now, usually I might do things on the chalkboard, or I might watercolor separately on a piece of paper, or I might talk through the lesson if there's not a lot of illustrations, and then my children might find their own artwork to illustrate. But for this main lesson block, I decided to do all of the artwork and all of the lessons in a main lesson book with her, so that she can copy the artwork and the lessons right out of this main lesson book, rather than having her do it completely on her own or copying from a chalkboard. So I'm going to share with you lesson by lesson what we did so far, but I want to share that we're using the Lyra Rembrandt Polycolor color pencil. Since we're working out of a main lesson book, we decided to do this all in color pencils rather than, say, doing it in a different art medium. I love using watercolors. That's why I got the watercolor book. We thought maybe we could approach this unit this way with watercolors, as I've done in the past, but we just got started with our color pencils and just kind of stuck with it, and it's worked out really well. So this one has 72 colors, and this is a combination of a few different sets, because we go through them pretty quickly, I want to say, but we primarily use a lot of the earth tones, the browns and the greens and the blues, especially the yellows and the pinks, purples and reds. We don't use quite as much. So this is a collection of a couple of different sets that we'll just keep using. And we have pencil extenders, so once they get quite small, actually this is a little bit too small, but if they get small, we just have a pencil extender and we can continue to use them. Okay, so for this lesson, we also include some opening activities. So before we do the actual lesson, we might read a picture book or play a game. So I want to show you two of the, interactive activities that I pulled for this unit. The first one, and actually, even though I pulled them for this unit and intended to play them, we actually played completely different games for our opening activities, so I'll share that too. But this one's called Natural Science Bingo. I really like the quality of the tiles. This is by Ibu. The illustrations are really beautiful, and on the back you have a little bit of information about the different image on the front, and then it comes with the larger tiles for playing. So it's just a classic bingo game, and this is just a fun way. We love using games and other things, and reading picture books in order to open up our main lesson. It's just a nice way to kind of invite the students into this space of learning. We also have How to Be a Wildflower deck. This one is not so much interactive as it is like super gorgeous and inspirational, but you have these really nicely illustrated cards, and on the back you have a little like a little motto or a saying, a quote, and this is just kind of nice if you had one of these each day to start your school day that you could read and reflect upon, or just have them on your nature table as something beautiful. Something that you can just kind of grab and just enjoy and reflect for a moment. So I bought these primarily because they are so gorgeous. They fit a lot of the themes that we have in our homeschool. I really like the sayings on the back. Okay, we also have a couple of picture books for this unit, and I only pulled a few books because we have a lot of nature-inspired picture books that would work really well for this kind of unit, but because we only did about 7 lessons, and we only went from fungi and lichen all the way up to horsetails and ferns, I didn't pull any of my books on like trees and other plants. So we have A Reason for a Flower, and this is just a really quick picture book, and this is a nice one just to give a nice overview of what a complete higher plant is. So in the Waldorf curriculum, we're going to be starting with fungi, moving to algae and lichen, and then moving up the evolution of plants until we get to the higher plant that has blossoms and fruit and seed. And so we start the first lesson looking at the complete plant so that the children have this complete whole form. And then we break it down and we start with a more primitive plant form, which I'm not sure if that's the correct way to say it. And also fungi are not part of the plant kingdom. And I'll discuss that a little bit further. So this is just a really easy, quick book to read. It's okay. Some books I pick up from the library bookstore or secondhand, and it works with our unit, but it might not be one that I would specifically pick up. A lot of these books that have been in our homeschool library for a while are either out of print or they're a little bit harder to find. So if you find something that's similar, that's totally fine. You know, the library always has a great selection of books for most of the units that we go through. Swirl by Swirl is a beautifully illustrated book that combines math with nature science. And so I pulled this book out specifically for the images on ferns because that was one of the lessons that we had. So as I went through lesson by lesson, there are a lot of resources that we used over and over again, but there were some books like this one, for instance, that I just used for our lesson on ferns. We also have We Are Gardeners, and this is just another fun picture book to start our homeschool day, and I really love the illustrations. They're really beautiful. It's just the kind of illustrations that I like. A lot of times I'll pick picture books based on the illustrations. So this is another fun one. We also have The Leaf Detective, and one thing that I specifically look for, or whenever I find it, I definitely try to add it into our homeschool library, are books on scientists, female scientists especially, biographies, females in any aspect of, civil rights or science or medicine. I try to include those for not just my daughter, but for my sons too. So my sons are older now, but I especially enjoy reading those books. I find them to be really inspirational and sometimes overlooked. And so whenever I find one that's female centered, then I definitely try to include that as well. So this was another book. Now that my children are a little bit older, I in the past would always read all the books, picture books, always. Now, sometimes we'll split the reading, and sometimes I'm listening as my daughter is reading, even when it comes to some of the main lesson content. Sometimes she's reading it aloud versus me, and that's kind of new because we've always had, although in the past, I'll confess that sometimes my son would want to read aloud, and he would on occasion. Sometimes it's harder for me to concentrate, funny enough. So sometimes I would read, and sometimes they would pick up when I would make mistakes in my reading, which I think is kind of interesting because I wouldn't hear them. So now sometimes my daughter is the one, and my students are the ones who are reading the picture books rather than I'm reading them to them. Tales of the Mushroom Folk. This is one that if you specifically wanted something on mushrooms or mushroom inspired, and of course there's some really beautiful illustrations of mushrooms in the back, as well as a guide on which ones are safe and edible and which ones are not, then this would be a nice book to add to the lesson on mushrooms. So I did not specifically find picture books and opening activities that fit with each particular lesson necessarily. We just pulled a variety of books, but I think it'd be really neat if you could actually find books that matched each one of the lessons. I think that would be a nice little way to tie things in. All right, so let me share with you real quick some of the resources for hands-on activities. Now for this unit, and we've done this in the past, we definitely did the mushroom growing kit, and Back to Roots has a great variety of mushroom kits, so they're super easy, affordable, easy to find, and you get really good results. I don't think I've ever had one that didn't work, so that's great for how reliable it is as a kit. If you want to do something completely on your own, I've got 2 books that could work well for this unit. Easy Peasy Gardening for Kids. This one is really beautifully illustrated. That's one of the reasons why I love it so much. Plus, I mean, this is kind of not, I guess, super important when it comes to books, but I also really like the paper that it's printed on. It's a little bit more, it's thick and a little bit more rough. It's not so shiny, and I like the illustrations, and these kinds of things like probably do not mean a lot to most people, but it does to me. I find that books are not just for the content, but the whole experience of reading a book and enjoying a book and handling a book is something that's important to me. So this book is going to have some really easy, simple projects that you can do with kids, especially in the garden primarily. And while you'll probably find a lot of these activities in other books, I think maybe in all of the books that I have that are similar, you're going to find maybe half of the projects are ones that you're going to see over and over again in other books, and maybe you might find one or two gems that you won't find anywhere else that's really unique for that particular book. So I wouldn't say that you need a great variety of them, because we've been homeschooling for so long and our library is pretty extensive. Sometimes I'm just pulling from what we already have. If they're not available, I'm sure that there are more current options, and sometimes more current options are better, and I'll talk to that point a little bit later as well. So this will be especially nice when we move into our spring portion of this unit where we will do a lot more gardening. Science with plants. This one's really neat, but it might be out of print. Actually, I'm fairly certain it's out of print. It is quite dated, but the projects are for the most part timeless. And this is another resource where you can do some projects with, especially indoor projects with growing. And so I do like it. This is not something I would recommend that you go out and try to find unless you happen to be at a bookstore. I do like the Usborne books quite a bit. I find them informative, easy to read, and maybe not the illustrations I would necessarily go for these days, but I do appreciate their illustrations. Okay, so let's go through lesson by lesson and the books that we used for each of them. So the first lesson was on the complete plant. So I'm going to show you the image that we used, or the drawing that we did for the complete plant, and also the books and the resources we use for this lesson. Now, in the past, we've done, I think, more of like a rose or an apple blossom plant and labeled it, but because we're doing this in the fall, I decided to do a pumpkin, so it kind of fits with the season. And then we went ahead and we still labeled everything so that we could understand the aspects of a complete plant. Then I wrote down a narration that originally I was going to have my daughter do her own original narration, and that's something with Waldorf main lesson blocks, is that you don't always have to have an illustration, but a lot of times there is something illustrated to go with the lesson, and then there's writing, and the writing is usually original content to the student, or it is a narration that the student can copy, or it's a narration that the student writes that has been dictated to the student or all the students. But there's always going to be some kind of writing and some kind of illustration for the most part with a lot of lessons. And I really like that approach, because by the time you're done with your whole unit, you have like this magnificent book that has all of this information in it that you have written, that you have drawn. It becomes your own textbook. And I really love that approach. And I also love that these end up becoming keepsakes versus worksheets or fill in the blank or something that's already been printed off. I do definitely keep samples of those, but they don't become keepsakes the way that our main lesson books are. So for lesson 1, we're looking at the complete plant. So resources that I've used for this lesson, and let me start with this one, because this Botanicum activity book goes along with this book, Botanicum, which is gorgeous, and I will show that to you. But this is the one that I was using for inspiration for our very first lesson, and I was about to draw the rose and or apple blossom when I was just flipping through this book, and I came across this image, and I decided, oh, you know what, let's do this one instead. So I pretty much copied it almost exactly out of this book. So This is where the inspiration came from. I did make a couple of changes, and I got the information online to show the difference between the male and female parts of the blossom, since that wasn't here. So this book is really beautiful. It's an activity book, so you can draw on it. In the past, we've taken out a few pages and we've used them, but for the most part, we haven't used it the way that it's intended to be used. We've used it for inspiration. We did play a couple of these games. We put our little stickies here so that we could remove our guesses and we could still use it. This would be another one where you could put, like, say, a clear sheet over it and then go through the maze so that you didn't ruin the actual book. But it actually is an activity book that goes along with Botanicum. Botanicum is so gorgeous, and if you have the budget for it, then I definitely recommend including it for a few reasons. One, the illustrations are just breathtaking. I absolutely love them so much. But what's also great about this book, especially if you're going to do a botany unit, is that it does go through the whole evolution of plants in a very similar way that we would approach it in our main lesson block, our Waldorf inspired main lesson block anyway. So I like that there's some information and then there's some illustrations, because if you're looking for things specifically on some of these areas of study, you may not find enough information in other books, and that's the issue that I ran into with most of my books that are pretty general, that cover a lot of different topics. There just wasn't enough in each one of these areas for our main lesson, but this one did have a lot of information, so I appreciate that, and really gorgeous illustrations. So we did use this for several of our lessons. New this time were some coloring books that I wanted to include. So I found 3, and I think I got them all from Amazon. And the first 2 that I want to share with you, and this is, again, I would use this at the beginning of our unit, like say the first lesson, and then we could use it throughout, but I ended up not using them at all. And the first one is called the Botany Coloring Book. And this one comes with a ton of information, but the illustrations, I didn't really care for them. I didn't care for the way the print was on this side. It does explain how to color them, and then it has like the information, but I just did not find it inspiring to use, even though it comes with a ton of information and it really goes into the details for a lot of the things that you might have a harder time finding detailed information for. If you're just doing general information about the evolution of plants, then that's fine. But this one gives you some really good detailed information, especially about the life cycle. We just ended up not using it at all. Botany coloring book, I was really excited about this one. Bought this one because of the cover. Found that it was absolutely not what we needed at all. My daughter's not into coloring like this, and this seems like if you were into coloring pages and you needed something that was more botany inspired, this would be great, but we are not going to end up using this at all. And the ones that were a little bit more scientific were at the beginning, we ended up not using them either. So it's possible that when we revisit this unit for the second half, we may end up using it, but at this time we didn't use it at all. Okay, so for lesson 1, we only used a couple of resources. So plant life cycles, this one was actually really informative, very easy to read. Don't really care for the photography so much. It's important to have when you're doing something scientific. I prefer the illustrations, and it was a really easy book. I think maybe this is like 3rd grade level. I'm actually not 100% sure, maybe 4th grade level, but it gave us a very clear start to finish about the life cycle of a plant, and so that came in handy. This book by DK Eyewitness called Plant, I have mixed feelings about the DK Eyewitness books. Some of the positive aspects about it is that you could open up to any 2-page spread and you can read about it without necessarily having to read the whole book. So that's great. The information is usually pretty short, just a paragraph or 2. So that's also great if you want to just read a little bit. I don't care for it because it doesn't read very smoothly like a narrative or some of the other books that we have. And the other thing that you may really love but I find difficult is all the little captions and the different little bits of the photographs with illustrations, the little captions that go with them, I have a hard time incorporating that, and then they seem just disjointed, and so as a read aloud, it just doesn't work so well. I did use this a little bit for the very first, a couple of the very first lessons, or the first 2-page spreads in here, where it talks about a plant and some of the very general aspects of it. I only used a few pages of it. So this would be a book that if you happen to already have, that's great. If you could find it secondhand, great. But to go out and buy it specifically for this unit, I would say that there are better resources instead. Oh, I forgot to share this book, A Seed is Sleepy. This is another read aloud that you could read before you started this unit. A Seed is Sleepy is just a beautifully illustrated picture book that goes through different seeds, and it's just in a very, I don't know, whimsical, kind of ethereal kind of way to talk about seeds, because it's really beautifully illustrated and it doesn't have a whole lot of information. So what's kind of neat about the way that this book is written is that you could read it for really, really young children and just read the part that's in a larger font. A seed is adventurous, and then you have a seed is inventive. And you could just go through and just read those, and then if you have older children, you could go and read in the remainder of what's on each page. And so I'm thinking, like, if you have, you know, like a 3 or 4-year-old, it might be just enough to read like the main parts of each of the pages. So that's another great one for, you know, reading aloud at the start of your unit, or the start of your homeschool day. Plant Life in Field and Garden. So this is by Arabella Buckley, and I have a few of her books, and I found that they were interesting because they were written, I believe, in the 1860s was the original publication date, but I don't have the one here on trees, but we did read it in the past for this unit, and I found that it wasn't relevant for us just because of when it was written and where it was written. But this one seemed a little bit more general, and it's a lot about the plant life cycle, and so this one was more relevant for this lesson. However, these are more resources than you would need for a single lesson, so you might just use a chapter of something that might be relevant for where you live. And if you wanted to use this entirely, then you might forego some of the other resources just because this will end up being quite a lengthy read. Okay, so let's move on to the next lesson, and the next lesson is on mushrooms and fungi. Oh, I just realized I forgot one of the books, so let me go grab it. Okay, so Fungarium is like Botanicum, super gorgeous, and definitely something that I would recommend including if you can, including this into your library. Okay, so this was a new edition. We bought Botanicum and I believe Animalium. I might be pronouncing that wrong. And then later I found that there were more by this publisher. There's one on astronomy and I think geography possibly, and then this one on fungi. So what's amazing about this book is that you're going to get so much information, gorgeous illustrations, and this ended up being hugely inspiring for our unit. Now I use this one a little bit more with our lessons on lichen because I ended up using this book called Humongous Fungus a lot, quite extensively. Now we use this one for inspiration for our illustrations for sure, because we decided to do some mushroom illustrations, and we definitely used this book as illustration inspiration. But what I really loved about this book was how thorough it was in its information, and we ended up reading this one almost cover to cover. We stopped towards the end when there were some there was some content that just wasn't relevant for our lessons at the time, but you can see that it goes into like extensive detail about fungi. So I really appreciate the thoroughness of this book, and I really, really love the illustrations a lot. So the illustrations also came in handy when we did a big project. The main hands-on project we did for this unit was to recreate a variety of mushrooms using the super Sculpey ultralight oven baked clay. This is a very soft moldable clay that's very easy to work with, and then you bake it and it becomes hard, and then you can paint it. So this is just one example of little mushrooms that we made, that we got the inspiration from a lot of the books, not just this one but other books as well. And then so we've got two projects going. One, at first we were just going to combine them and both of us were going to do one project together, but then we ended up separating them, and my daughter will do mushrooms focused on the pink, purple, and red families of mushrooms, and I did the ones that were a little bit more earth toned and whatnot. So this book came in handy with some of, you know, how to shape them and what they would look like. And I really liked the way that the project turned out. It ended up being quite a bit more challenging originally, but then when we finally got it done, it looks fabulous. Okay, so two more books that we specifically used for fungi, as well as I have a lot of books that we used a little bit of for all of our lessons, and I definitely want to share these with you. So we used Mushrooms of the World with pictures to color. So again, I was looking for, this is the last one of the books that I was looking for, of something that my daughter could color in. Now and we didn't use any of them. However, of the three, I do really like this one because I feel like there isn't too much, like it's detailed enough, not over detailed. It looks like it would be a lot of fun to color. It gives some information at the bottom. It just seems like a nice balance between the two. One that seemed a little bit heavy on the science, which is great, which I think that one of the three books is probably the one that's of more value, especially since my daughter is a little bit on the older side. If you were doing this botany lesson with younger students, then maybe the easier coloring pages might be better. But I do like this one for it being kind of a little bit in between the two. And then at the back of the book, you have some colorful illustrations as well as the back and the front, so that you can try to color in your mushrooms accordingly. Otherwise, you could just do whatever you wanted, but if you wanted them to be a little bit more accurate, you have here the references. So really nice resource. We just ended up not using it. I should have shared this one with the activity books. This one's called Funky Fungi, and this one is not just informative, but it has a lot of projects that you can do. So we really like our hands-on projects for our units. And the only project that we did, and it wasn't even necessarily inspired by this book, was our mushroom growing kit. However, there are some in here that I'll mark at the back of the book. I love the full back stickies by Post-it. Put them on the back of the book. I'll sometimes put notes on how we liked the book. And then if we're going to be doing any projects, I'll write them on the back of the book, and I'll also add any supplies that we might need. And that way it's just a quick reference for what we might need for a unit. So there were a couple of projects that we wanted to do in here, but we didn't do any of them yet. However, some of them are fairly easy to do, like making dough and using yeast, and that's an easy-ish one to do, or making I think sauerkraut might incorporate using like the natural fungi that's already on plants to begin with. So this is another one that was new for this unit. I do really like it. However, we didn't use it at all, but I really appreciate hands-on activity books. Okay, let me show you the ones that we used that a little bit for each of our lessons. I'm going to show you the best one first, because if there's only one book to buy for this entire unit, it would be this book or something similar to this book, because this is published in the 1980s, so it is probably harder to find and definitely out of print. So The ABCs of Nature, a family answer book. This is by Reader's Digest. This one, and yes, it is dated when it comes to the photographs and illustrations, but not too bad, not too bad. But what's amazing is that it comes with a ton of content on very specific topic areas, which I really do appreciate. So we used the pages on algae extensively, molds and mushrooms, and lichen, mosses, horsetails, and ferns. So we use this book a lot. A lot of the inspiration for our illustrations came from this book. So like here you have some mushrooms. That definitely was inspiration for our illustrations. And then as we moved into the other lessons, a lot of this inspiration came from this book. So this is definitely one that I would recommend. The other books that we used that had limited, limited use for this unit. Curious Kids Nature Guide. What's really nice about this book is that I love the illustrations. And it has a little bit about a lot of topics. And this is great if you're just doing something kind of maybe not so intense, not so deep, not so technical. Then having something like this is really great because you're going to get a nice little bit of a lot of different things. It didn't end up being helpful to us just because of the detail that I needed for some of these more specific topics. But we did use this 2-page spread on mushrooms and lichen and ferns. So we did refer to it, but only for these 2 pages. The Practical Naturalist is another one that's going to go through a lot of information, a lot of topics with a little bit of information. This one has almost all photographs versus illustrations. And again, like, it's nice to have a balance of the two. Since I prefer illustrations, it's nice to actually bring in some actual photographs. We only use this book very, very limitedly for the few pages that had illustrations or photographs on the topic areas. And I did go ahead and mark them on the back of the book so that we could easily find those pages. So they had some on mushrooms and ferns and mosses. The Curious Nature Guide, this is another one that again has a lot of topic areas and not a ton of information. We did use this one for lichen and for ferns. So we just primarily used this 2-page spread, or a few more pages for those lessons, and that was about it. But I do want to share where we did use them for illustrations, because I do want to definitely give those references. Okay, so Nature Anatomy is one that we've had before, that we've used before for our other lessons. I do really like it, especially because it's illustrated, and I prefer illustrations over photographs, and also it lended itself really well for our own inspiration for drawing, because when you're copying, in my opinion, my experience, when you're copying a drawing, it's a little bit easier than copying it from a photograph. So I did use this one for Anatomy of a Fern and for the lesson on mushrooms. So let me share with you what that looked like. So for our mushroom, you can see that we copied this page into our book. However, I did add to it a little bit more than what the book provided. And then for that, I used other books as resources, as well as some online references as well. Okay, we move into algae and seaweed. And for this book, or for this lesson, we used a few books. So let me grab those for you. Let's make some space here. Okay. So we used Seashore, another DKI Witness book, And for this one, it definitely wasn't a book that we read cover to cover. We only used maybe 3 or 4 pages that talked about the seaweed that we were planning to draw, and then we also used some of these as illustration inspiration. So you can see in here that we just copied some of these different images into our book. We also used an ocean garden, and this was a new purchase for this unit, and it was nice, but definitely not one that I would purchase again. What's really beautiful about this book is that it's very artistically done with gorgeous photographs. The way that it's written does definitely have information, but it also has more of a personal note from the author, how they would go out to the ocean, what they were looking for, how the tides were. And that's nice. It definitely adds like some personal aspect to the book, but it wasn't what I was looking for necessarily. But we did use this. We did read through some of the different parts of the book, and then we did also use it for drawing inspiration. There was an image in here specifically that I used, and I can't locate it now, but we did use this also as illustration inspiration. And then the last book is Ocean Anatomy, and there were only a couple of sections in here. I used this image here, Anatomy of a Seaweed, and it came either from, oh, there it is. I was going to say from this book or Nature Anatomy, but it was actually from here. Anatomy of a Seaweed. This illustration, I copied it right here. So this book as well as this book came in handy for illustration inspiration just because they are already illustrated books. But they are books that cover a lot of a lot of topics, but not a lot of information for each one of the topics. However, I did find this, maybe it's because of the way that it's laid out or the kind of information that was provided. I do find these to be good resources when you're doing a unit on science or botany, etc. The next lesson that we did was on lichen, and for this unit I pulled out a few resources that we've collected over the years. And so we had some lichen, two samples, a few more samples actually, that we included when we were doing our lesson so that we'd had something visual. But then we primarily used it, in addition, of course, to our main lesson book by Live Education, we used this book for the lichen quite a bit. We also used this for our drawing inspiration, and then for other parts of this illustration, we used some online resources. Then there's this image here of the bird using lichen for the nest. We use that as well right here. Okay, moving on to the next lesson, we have mosses. And for this lesson, in addition to using the ABCs of nature, you can see that this was the illustration inspiration for this. And then the life cycle of mosses, again, was used down here. So in addition to this book, we also used Botanicum, and there's just this 2-page spread that we used as well, and we read the information for that lesson. Okay, we move on to club mosses and horsetail. So in our Waldorf main lesson book, the horsetail and ferns are together as one lesson, but we decided to split it up into 2 lessons. And then for that, in addition to using Botanicum, which has club mosses and horsetails, and then it also has whisk ferns as part of this lesson, but then it also has ferns separately. We, of course, used the ABCs of nature, and this one does divide up the the club mosses and horsetails. It does divide it up into 2 different lessons, and this kind of inspired me to do that as well rather than keep them as one lesson. So then we used these images as illustration inspiration here, and then the last one that we did, Anatomy of a Fern and then the ferns in general. That came from this book, so I copied this specifically here. This whole life cycle of a fern I got from the internet, and then this image here was from the book Botanicum. So I definitely want to share like the images that I copied, because none of them are original artwork. They're all copied from other resources, and the information is taken from all of the books that I've shared with you. So the lessons will continue, so we still have more than half of our main lesson book available. I do end up ripping out the tissue paper in between because I do like to see the whole 2-page spread. However, as I rip it out for the next lesson, I do put the tissue paper here so that when we're writing, this doesn't transfer onto the other page. And on occasion, I would forget, and then you could see some marks that were transferred over. And to avoid that, you just need to have the tissue paper. I would take them out because sometimes I would want to see the whole 2-page spread. Okay. I think that was everything. The last thing that I'm going to share with you before I end this is from a different unit that we did, but I do want to share that once the unit is done, or rather once we resume this unit later on in the school year, we are going to take all of the information that we've already learned throughout these previous lessons and turn them into these little trivia cards. And my daughter will do her own set based on all of the writing that she has done. And I will do my own set, and then we will quiz each other. And so this is a great way to recap the information. So we'll do our watercolor illustrations on all of these different topic areas. And then on the back, we'll write some questions with, usually it's a little easier to do question answer versus just open-ended questions for a game like this. And that will be a great way to review this information before we move on to the second half of this unit. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this reflection on the materials that we use for this unit. If you'd like to see a complete list of the books, you can check that out on my website at pepperandpine.com. You can also see how we are homeschooling on a daily basis by visiting me on Instagram at pepperandpine.